For nearly 700 years, the deadliest catastrophe in human history kept one final secret. We knew what the Black Death did. We knew it erased half of Europe in a handful of years. But the one question that mattered most, the question of where it truly began, remained unanswered, buried under centuries of guesswork and one confident answer that turned out to be wrong. Then, a handful of teeth pulled from a forgotten graveyard, and the tools of modern genetics finally cracked it open. And the truth was not where the history books had been pointing all along. It was somewhere almost no one had ever seriously thought to look, a quiet valley at the roof of the world. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. To understand why the origin mattered so much, you have to understand the scale of what was unleashed. The Black Death swept across Europe between the years 1346 and 1353. And in that short window, it became, by most measures, the single greatest mortality event ever recorded. Estimates of the dead reach as high as 50 million people. In many regions, somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population simply vanished, wiped out in a matter of months. Whole villages emptied, cities lost so many people that the survivors could not bury them all, and bodies were stacked in pits and left in the streets. The North African and Near Eastern death tolls were comparable. It was not merely a disease. It was the collapse of a civilization's certainty that the world would continue as it always had, and the consequences did not end with the dying. The Black Death shattered the medieval order itself. So many laborers died that the survivors could suddenly demand wages and freedom, cracking the foundations of the feudal system. Faith was shaken to its core as people watched priests die alongside sinners and prayers go unanswered. Art turned obsessive and dark, fixated on death. In a few short years, a single microbe rewrote the economy, the religion, and the psychology of an entire continent. This was, by any honest measure, one of the hinge points of human history, which is exactly why the question of its origin was never a trivial one. The bacterium responsible was Yersinia pestis, the plague, carried by fleas riding on rats and, in its most lethal form, passing directly from lung to lung between human beings. But knowing the culprit was never the same as knowing the crime scene. For centuries, one enormous question hung over the whole disaster. This thing that killed tens of millions, that reshaped the economy, the religion, and the very structure of the medieval world. Where on earth did it actually come from? And for most of those centuries, the answer people gave was not just incomplete, it was wrong. Here's the story that most people were taught, the story that appeared in textbook after textbook, presented with total confidence. The Black Death, they said, came from China. It emerged somewhere in the Far East, traveled west along the Silk Road with merchants and Mongol armies, and arrived at the edge of Europe ready to kill. It sounded clean, it sounded settled, and a genetic study published in 2011 seemed to give it real weight, tracing the deep, ancient family tree of the plague bacterium back toward China more than 2,000 years ago. But there was a problem that the confident version quietly ignored. The actual historical evidence for a great plague epidemic ravaging China in the years right before the Black Death is remarkably thin. The tidy story that it all started in China was built far more on assumption than on proof. Yes, the deep ancestor of the plague bacterium had roots in the East across thousands of years. But that is a completely different question from where the specific strain that caused the Black Death in the specific years it struck actually erupted into human beings. Confusing those two questions let a guess harden into a fact. It is a little like finding that a family's distant ancestors came from one country and then insisting a particular grandchild must have been born there too. The deep past and the immediate event are not the same thing, and the old story quietly treated them as if they were. And so, for around 270 years, scholars argued. Some pointed at China, some pointed at the steppes of Central Asia, some pointed at the Middle East, or even at Europe itself. Chroniclers of the time had blamed everything from poisoned wells to the alignment of the planets. The immediate birthplace of the deadliest pandemic in history was, in truth, a genuine mystery. dressed up in a confident answer that the evidence could not actually support. What the world needed was not another argument or another elegant theory spun from a handful of medieval letters. It was a body. It was proof. And the proof, it turned out, had been sitting in the ground for almost 700 years, in a place almost no one thought to look, waiting for a science that had not yet been invented. The clue that would finally break the case had been hiding in plain sight since the 1880s. In the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, in a place called the Chui Valley, near a great lake named Issyk-Kul, in what is today northern Kyrgyzstan, there were two old cemeteries, Karajigak and Burana. They belonged to a medieval community of Nestorian Christians, a trading people who lived along the Silk Road and wrote in the Syriac language. And when archaeologists first excavated these graves in the late 19th century, they noticed something deeply strange. There was a spike, a sudden, disproportionate cluster of burials, all dated to just 2 years, 1338 and 1339. And on some of those tombstones, carved into the stone in Syriac, was a single haunting word repeated across grave after grave: pestilence. One inscription, translated, reads almost like a whisper across the centuries. In the year of the tiger, this is the tomb of the believer Sanmak. He died of pestilence. These were not anonymous victims. They had names and faith, and families who took the time to carve their grief into stone even as the dying spread around them. Think about the timing, 1338 and 1339. That is 8 years before the Black Death is recorded arriving in Europe, a sudden mass death from an unnamed pestilence in a Silk Road trading community in Central Asia, less than a decade before the whole world caught fire. For over a century, ever since the graves were first opened in the 1880s, those tombstones tantalized historians. Could this be it? Could this quiet valley be the cradle of the catastrophe? But there was no way to know for certain. A tombstone can tell you that people died of a plague. It cannot tell you which one. The word pestilence could mean typhus or smallpox or a dozen other killers of the medieval world. And so the stone sat at the center of a long, bitter, unresolvable debate, a cornerstone of controversy for well over 200 years. The mystery needed something a stone could never give. It needed to know exactly what had killed the people buried beneath it, down to the level of the microbe itself. That is where ancient DNA changed everything. In 2022, an international team of scientists and historians, led by researchers from the Max Planck Institute, the University of Tübingen, and the University of Stirling, went back to those old excavated remains. And they did something the 19th century diggers could never have dreamed of. They drilled into the teeth of the people buried in those graves. Because when a person dies with a bacterium coursing through their bloodstream, traces of that bacterium's DNA can be sealed inside the pulp of their teeth, preserved for centuries like a message in a bottle. If the pestilence on those tombstones was truly the plague, the evidence would still be there, locked in the bone. It was. The researchers recovered the DNA of Yersinia pestis from individuals whose tombstones were carved with the year 1338. The pestilence in that valley was, without question, the plague. But that alone was not the breakthrough. The breakthrough was what happened when they read the strange genetic code and placed it on the family tree of the plague bacterium. Because scientists had long known of a moment they called the Big Bang. At some point in the early 14th century, Yersinia pestis had suddenly exploded outward, splitting into multiple new branches, a burst of diversification that gave rise to nearly all the plague strains that would circle the globe for the next 500 years, including the Black Death itself. Picture the family tree of the plague and imagine a single point from which 4 great limbs suddenly branch out at once. That is the Big Bang. For years, geneticists could see this explosion in the data, could see the branches all converging back toward one missing point, but they could not find the single ancestor sitting at its center, the source strain from which all those branches sprang. It was like having every road on a map led back to a city that was not labeled. And when the team placed the Issyk-Kul strain onto the tree, there it was, The strain from that quiet Kyrgyz valley was the most recent common ancestor of the Big Bang. It sat at the exact node from which the Black Death and its descendants all radiated outward. Not near it, on it. This was not merely an early case of plague, and it was not a cousin of the killer. It was the direct ancestor, the single genetic point from which the deadliest pandemic in history was born. The strain that died in Sanmak and his neighbors in 1338 was the seed of the storm that would break over Europe 8 years later. After 270 years of argument, the case was not just strengthened, it was closed. This was the root, the source, the beginning. If you have ever wanted to see the moment a centuries-old mystery is actually solved by hard evidence, this is it. And recovering exactly these buried truths is the entire reason this channel exists, so take a moment to subscribe. There's something almost miraculous about it, that the truth of one of history's greatest disasters could survive, unread, for 700 years, in the teeth of forgotten dead, until we finally built the tools to hear it. Because knowing where the strain emerged only raised the next question. Where did it come from before the people? What put it into that valley in the first place? The answer to that lies not in a city, but in the mountains themselves, and in the animals that live in them. Plague is not, at its heart, a human disease. It is a disease of rodents. The bacterium lives quietly, permanently, inside populations of wild rodents across certain regions of the world, in what scientists call plague reservoirs. It circulates among them for centuries, flaring and fading, and only spills over into human beings when the conditions are right. So the real question was never simply which town the outbreak hit first. It was which reservoir the strain crawled out of, and the DNA answered that too. When the researchers compared their ancient strain to the plague still living in wild rodents today, they found that its closest living relatives are found in the reservoirs of the very same region, the plague foci around the Tian Shan Mountains. The strain had not been carried into that valley from somewhere far away. It had emerged locally, boiling up out of the mountain rodents right there. The disease was, in a sense, a native of those mountains and had been for a very long time before it ever touched the people of Korajigak. And in those mountains lives an animal that sits at the dark heart of this story. The marmot, a large ground squirrel, and in particular, the ptarmigan, a creature the peoples of Central Asia had hunted for its fur and its meat for countless generations. Plague and the marmot had coexisted in the Tian Shan for ages, the bacterium passing quietly from animal to animal, held in a kind of ancient balance that rarely spilled into humans. But that balance was fragile, and it depended on people leaving that reservoir undisturbed. The plague slept in the marmots of the Tian Shan, and one day, in a Silk Road community at the foot of those mountains, through a hunt or a bite or a traded pelt, it woke up and crossed into people. What happened next would depend entirely on what kind of world those people were connected to. But this is where the deepest truth of the whole story emerges, and it is the part that truly overturns the old confident narrative. If the Black Death began in the marmots of one Central Asian mountain range, how did it possibly spread across the entire known world in less than a decade? Marmots cannot do it. They are territorial animals. They do not migrate over long distances. A disease sitting in the rodents of the Tian Shan should have stayed in the Tian Shan, flaring and fading as it had for centuries, going nowhere. Something had to carry it out, and that something was not an animal, it was us. The 14th century was the age of the Mongol Empire, the largest land empire the world has ever known, and its network of roads, armies, and trade routes stitched Central Asia directly to the Middle East, to the Black Sea, and to the doorstep of Europe. Historians have argued compellingly that human beings were the ones who pulled the plague out of the mountains. The Mongols hunted and ate marmots. Their armies and their caravans moved constantly across the very ground where the disease lived. The Silk Road, that great artery of commerce that had carried silk and spice and ideas for 1,000 years, now carried something else in the fleas and the rats and the grain sacks of the merchants who traveled it. A local spillover, which nature would have contained, was picked up by the most connected human network on Earth and flung across the continent. By the middle of the 1340s, the plague had reached the Black Sea, moving with the trade and the armies of the Mongol Golden Horde. And here the story passes through its most famous and most misunderstood moment. In 1346, the Golden Horde laid siege to the Genoese trading port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast. According to a dramatic account written by an Italian named Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongol army, ravaged by plague itself, catapulted the corpses of its own dead over the city walls, deliberately hurling infection at the defenders in what is often called the first act of biological warfare in history. It is a gripping image, one of the most famous scenes in the whole history of disease. But here honesty demands a correction, because modern scholars now strongly doubt that this is how the plague actually entered Europe. The de Mussi account was written by a man who was almost certainly not even there, and the more likely and less cinematic route was simply the everyday machinery of trade, plague-carrying rodents hiding in the grain, and goods moving through the crowded Black Sea ports well before and beyond that single siege. The bodies over the walls make a better story. The rats in the grain sacks are the truer one. It is a small but perfect example of the whole lesson of this discovery, how a dramatic, memorable tale can crowd out a duller, more accurate truth for centuries, until someone finally goes back and checks the evidence. However it happened, in 1347, the Genoese fled Kaffa by sea. Their galleys sailed for home, and the plague sailed with them, hidden in the ship rats and their fleas. They reached the ports of Sicily and Italy, and from there the Black Death poured into Europe, following every trade route the medieval world had built until it had touched nearly everything. The disease that woke up in a marmot on a Kyrgyz mountainside ended within a few years in the mass graves of London, Paris, and Florence. So step back now and see what the ancient DNA actually revealed, because it is far more than a dot on a map. It revealed first that the confident old story was wrong. The Black Death did not begin in China in any meaningful sense of that claim. That answer, repeated for generations as settled fact, rested on a confusion between the deep ancient roots of the bacterium and the specific outbreak that killed half of Europe. The real ignition point was a specific valley in the Tian Shan Mountains of Kyrgyzstan in the years 1338 and 1339, and we now know that not because someone argued it more cleverly, but because the DNA of the dead said so, in a language that cannot be spun or misremembered. But it revealed something deeper too. It revealed that the true cause of the Black Death was never really a place at all. The plague had lived in those mountains harmlessly to humans for a very long time. What turned a sleeping mountain disease into the deadliest pandemic in history was not the marmot and not the microbe. It was the human world that had grown up around it, an empire and a trade network so vast and so connected that it could take a single spillover in one remote valley and carry it within a few short years to the far edge of a continent. The Black Death was not something that simply happened to humanity. It was something humanity's own networks helped create. The plague provided the spark. The Silk Road, the empire, and the endless movement of people and goods provided everything else. That is the quiet, uncomfortable heart of the discovery. For centuries, we searched for a guilty place, as if some cursed corner of the map had unleashed the horror on an innocent world. But there was no cursed place. There was only a disease doing what diseases have always done, and a civilization so interconnected that it turned a local misfortune into a global apocalypse. The finger we spent 700 years pointing outward at China, at the East, at some distant other, was pointing in the wrong direction the entire time. Part of the answer was always pointing back at us. And that is why this discovery matters far beyond a medieval history lesson. For 700 years, we told ourselves a story about the Black Death that pointed the finger in the wrong direction and missed the real lesson entirely. We were looking for a guilty place when we should have been looking at a guilty pattern, because the pattern has never gone away. Every major pandemic in human history, from that medieval catastrophe to the ones in living memory, follows the same grim logic. A pathogen that has lived quietly in some animal reservoir for ages spills over into people, and then our own systems, our trade, our travel, our appetite, our relentless connection, take that spark and turn it into a firestorm. The ancient DNA did not just solve a mystery about the past, it handed us a warning about the present. The people buried at Karajigak did not know they were standing at the beginning of the end of their world. They carved their grief into stone, buried their dead, and their tombstones sat silent for almost 7 centuries, while historians argued over a story that was never quite true. And then, at last, the science learned to listen not to the confident narratives, but to the evidence sealed inside the teeth of the dead. The stones told us that they died of a pestilence. The DNA finally told us which one and where it began and what it would become. History had given everyone the wrong answer for 700 years. The dead, patient, and unarguable, gave us the right one at last.